To anyone who believes courage means feeling no fear, let me tell you, true courage is running on pure terror and refusing to quit. I discovered that truth the day a grizzly decided I was prey. Stay with me, because the way this ends will tear open everything you think you know about fear, survival, and the meaning of coming home. I woke in Denali National Park to bitter cold and a sky fading from black to deep blue, frost coating my tent like tiny glass shards, catching the first hint of light. My breath billowed in front of me as I crawled out, boots crunching into hard-packed snow, each step echoing louder than normal in the frozen silence. I was there for winter survival drills, part of my unit's training, meant to push us into the wild alone and force us to trust our instincts and gear. Everything smelled of pine resin and icy air, clean but sharp enough to sting the inside of my nose, reminding me how unforgiving this place could be. My routine felt automatic. Check supplies, scan my radio, log my position, keep moving, stay warm, stay sharp. But as I began my patrol, a strange hush settled over the trees. The usual bird calls gone, the forest tense, like it was waiting for something. I told myself not to get spooked, but an uneasy feeling crept over me, making me glance into every patch of shadow. My boots kept slipping over hidden ice, and I cursed under my breath, annoyed that nerves were getting the better of me this early in the day. I could feel sweat freezing along my spine, my gear growing heavier with every step, and the sense that I was being watched refused to leave me. Somewhere deep in the woods, I heard a single crack, a branch snapping sharp as a gunshot, and I froze, rifle half raised, listening for any follow-up sound. I tried to calm my breathing, telling myself it was just a falling limb, but my pulse kept hammering so hard it drowned out the wind. Snow drifted off the branches, swirling like tiny ghosts around me, and I realized the air had picked up a faint, musky scent that made my stomach tighten. It wasn't the smell of earth or trees, but something warm, alive, and powerful, as if the wilderness itself was pressing closer. I scanned the white landscape, my eyes flicking left and right, looking for any shift of brown fur or a pair of eyes glinting from under the boughs. The forest felt tighter than usual, the spaces between trees shrinking, the shadows stretching longer as clouds rolled across the sun. My boots crunched forward, each footstep sounding impossibly loud, and I kept replaying old lectures in my head about how grizzlies usually avoided people. But this silence didn't feel like avoidance, it felt like stalking. A raven suddenly cawed overhead, so loud it made me flinch and whip my rifle up, though I dropped it back down just as quickly. I swallowed hard, embarrassed at how jumpy I'd become. But I couldn't shake the dread crawling beneath my skin. My eyes watered from the cold, blurring my vision for a second, and I blinked it away, refusing to show weakness even to an empty forest. Still, I couldn't deny that the atmosphere was shifting into something dangerous, as if the whole wilderness was inhaling before a scream. I pressed on, determined not to call into my unit and admit I felt spooked, because a soldier's pride can be as sharp as a blade. The sun finally pushed through the clouds, casting a silver glow on the snow, making it sparkle like crushed glass, beautiful, but somehow sinister. The wind brought another wave of that heavy scent, thicker now, and I felt the first real shiver of fear crawl up my neck. I spotted tracks ahead, deep depressions in the snow, as wide as my open hand and spaced far apart, each one perfect and sharp like they'd been left moments before. Kneeling down, I brushed snow aside and traced the claw marks etched into the surface, feeling the tremor in my fingers even through my gloves. It was the print of a grizzly, enormous, powerful and terrifyingly fresh, and the realization made my mouth go dry. My training told me to back off, make noise, avoid surprising the animal, but another voice in my head whispered that I couldn't afford to look weak or rattled. The idea that something so huge could be so close and yet invisible made me scan the trees again, my breath fast and shallow. My boots shifted slightly in the snow, crunching softly as I rose, and I kept my rifle loose but ready. The weight of my pack seemed to double as I stood there, heart pounding, knowing that the day I thought would be just another drill had shifted into something else entirely, and somewhere deep inside me, a small voice was already screaming that this wasn't going to end without blood. I forced myself to keep moving, though every step felt like wading into danger, my senses hyper-aware of the way sound carried across the stillness. Each tree seemed to lean closer, as if hiding secrets in its dark branches, and the shadows between them looked deeper than before. I kept my rifle across my chest, finger resting near the safety, trying to breathe slowly and keep my mind clear, though images of a grizzly lunging at me flashed behind my eyes. My boots slipped slightly on a hidden patch of ice, nearly sending me to my knees, and I caught myself with a muffled grunt. For a second, I considered turning back toward camp, admitting I'd seen fresh bear sign and calling for extraction. But pride and stubbornness won out. I told myself over and over that grizzlies didn't just attack without reason, that if I stayed calm and smart, I'd finish my route safely. Yet the silence kept pressing in, thick and heavy, until it felt like the snow itself was holding its breath. The sun glared off the snow so brightly that I had to squint, and spots danced in my vision, making it even harder to pick out any movement. Somewhere behind me, another crack split the air, closer than the last, sharp enough to slice straight through my chest like a blade. I whirled, weapon raised, scanning the trees, convinced I'd finally see a shape coming at me. But the forest stood empty and silent, except for the slow drift of snow falling like ash. I stood there panting, shoulders tense, the cold seeping through my clothes until it felt like ice was crystallizing around my ribs. My breath came out in steaming bursts, fogging the space between me and the trees, making it harder to tell if something moved beyond that shifting curtain of white. My heartbeat pounded so hard that I could feel it in my teeth, like distant artillery fire rattling my bones, and for a moment I felt a strange calm slide over me. Part of me wanted to laugh at how I'd ever believed a war zone was the scariest place on earth. Here, there were no rules, no negotiations, just the raw laws of predator and prey. The scent returned again, stronger, tinged with the faint metallic bite of blood, and my skin erupted in goosebumps. I gripped my rifle until my knuckles ached, refusing to lower it even as the silence stretched out into eternity. The shadows shifted as a breeze rippled through the branches, carrying another faint sound, almost like breathing, so low I wasn't sure if I imagined it. I turned in a slow circle, eyes scanning for the flash of fur, for the weight of a predator stepping into view. And in that moment, with the snow shining around me and my breath roaring in my ears, I knew that whatever was waiting out there wasn't finished with me yet. The sound hit me first, a low, explosive huff that seemed to vibrate through my ribs like an engine starting deep underground, and before my brain could even register the shape, I saw a flash of brown surging out of the trees. The grizzly came at me with a speed I'd never imagined for something so huge, its fur rippling over slabs of muscle, snow flying in great arcs around its pounding paws. Its eyes locked on mine, black and bottomless, not angry but focused, as if the space between us didn't exist anymore. I tried to shout, to raise my rifle higher, but my voice came out as a strangled grunt, my arms moving sluggishly like I was underwater. The bear's breath poured from its jaws in steamy clouds, and I could see strands of saliva hanging between yellow teeth that seemed too big to fit in its skull. Time seemed to break apart into frozen frames as it barreled closer, and I remember thinking that this was it, that after all the places I'd been, after war zones and firefights, I was about to die alone in the snow. My boots slipped as I staggered back, my rifle coming up too late, my finger squeezing the trigger without even aiming, praying that noise might scare it off. The shot cracked like a thunderclap, echoing across the trees, but the bear didn't even flinch. It just lowered its head and charged. Snow exploded upward as it lunged, and I felt my chest seize with pure animal terror, my instincts screaming at me to run. I tried to pivot, But the grizzly was already there, a mountain of heat and muscle crashing into me like a freight train. I went down hard, my back slamming into the snow, all the air punching out of my lungs in a white burst, and the bear came right over me, massive paws pressing into my shoulders, the claws punching through my outer jacket as easily as tearing paper. I screamed as hot pain tore into my left arm, a ripping sensation that felt like my skin was being peeled away, while the bear's weight pinned me down, stealing my breath. I could smell its fur, damp and wild, carrying the sharp stink of earth and blood, and its breath washed over my face in steaming gusts that smelled like meat gone sour. Its jaws snapped inches from my neck, flecks of foam flying from its lips, and I could see bits of frozen snow caught in the fur around its eyes. My helmet shifted sideways under the crushing weight, pressing snow into my cheek, blinding me for a second as I thrashed and tried to push the bear's chest away. My rifle was trapped between us, useless, the barrel digging into my ribs while I clawed at the animal's thick fur with my free hand, feeling muscles shift beneath my fingers like cables under tension. A roar tore out of the grizzly's throat, so loud I felt it in my bones, vibrating through my skull like a shockwave, and my vision went spotted and dark at the edges. I tried punching it in the snout, but it might as well have been hitting a brick wall. The bear barely reacted, just shifted its weight and leaned closer. I could feel blood trickling down my arm, soaking into the snow below, turning white into red. My mind flashed through 1,000 images, family, home, the faces of friends I'd lost in combat, and I remember thinking that dying under a bear felt impossibly small after surviving so much war. Desperation took over, and I twisted sideways with every ounce of strength I had left, managing to shift enough that the bear's jaws snapped closed on the side of my shoulder instead of my throat. Pain shot through me like electricity. A bolt of white heat that made me scream so loudly, my voice broke into raw gasps, and I felt teeth sink through layers of fabric and into flesh. The weight of its body pressed me deeper into the snow, and I couldn't move my legs, pinned flat beneath its chest. The bear's claws scraped across my ribs, sending another wave of pain radiating through my torso as I struggled to keep my other arm free. Snow kept flying into my eyes, blinding me between ragged blinks, and for a second I felt like I was drowning in cold and blood and fur. My helmet shifted again, half torn from my head, the chin strap biting into my jaw as I thrashed wildly. I could hear a high, keening noise and realized it was coming from me, a thin animal sound I'd never heard myself make, not even in the worst firefights overseas. The bear gave another low growl, deep and bubbling, its breath washing over my cheek, smelling of old meat and coppery blood. I slammed my fist into its muzzle again and again, feeling the shock of bone against bone, and finally the bear recoiled just an inch. It was enough for me to gasp in air and twist my hips, trying to shove the barrel of my rifle between us. My vision wavered, the edges darkening like someone turning down a dimmer switch on the world. I felt something shift then, a slight easing of the weight pressing me into the snow as the bear rose up halfway, towering over me on its hind legs, shoulders wide as a doorway, claws dripping red onto the snow. Its breath steamed out in thick clouds, its head swaying side to side, eyes locked onto mine with a look that was neither rage nor fear, just raw, primal calculation. For a split second, I thought maybe it would leave. Maybe the gunshot and my screaming had convinced it I wasn't worth the effort, and hope flared like a tiny spark inside my chest. But then it dropped forward again, front paws slamming the snow on either side of my helmet so hard that ice shards flew into my face. A fresh roar ripped from its chest, deeper and angrier than before, and I felt the thump of its heartbeat through its forearms as it leaned closer. Its massive jaws opened wide, strings of saliva stretching between its teeth, and the sound it made was so deep it felt like it was echoing inside my skull. I tried to twist away, but pain screamed through my shoulder and arm, and I felt warm blood trickling faster down my sleeve. The grizzly's eyes seemed almost human for an instant, shining with a mix of curiosity and hunger. as though it was weighing whether I was still worth the kill. And in that instant I realized I was too weak to push it off a second time, if it came down hard again. I braced for the final strike, teeth clenched, praying for any miracle that might keep me alive. Suddenly, a distant yell cut through the forest, a human voice, sharp and desperate, and the grizzly's head jerked up, ears flicking toward the sound like radar dishes. The weight pressing me into the snow lightened as the bear shifted its bulk sideways, still looming over me, but no longer fully crushing my chest. And for the first time, I sucked in a full lungful of air. The voice called out again, closer this time, and I caught the faint crunch of boots running over the snow, pounding toward us through the trees. The grizzly swung its head side to side, torn between finishing me off and facing whatever was crashing toward us. Its lips peeled back in a silent snarl, froth flecking the dark fur around its mouth, and I could see spittle freeze in midair as it flew off its whiskers. A shape burst into the clearing, a fellow soldier, face pale under his helmet, yelling my name as he raised his rifle, and for an instant time seemed to fracture into shards. The bear wheeled around, muscles rippling under its coat, and lunged a step toward my friend, roaring so loud I felt it vibrate through the snow beneath me. My own voice croaked out his name, trying to warn him, but it came out broken and small, buried under the bear's rage. The newcomer fired 2 shots that cracked through the clearing, sending echoes bouncing off the trunks, and the grizzly reared back on its hind legs as though shocked by the noise. Snow exploded around its paws as it dropped down again, but instead of charging, it pivoted sharply and crashed into the trees, branches whipping and bending as it fled into the shadows, leaving behind a swirling chaos of disturbed snow and silence. I don't remember the seconds right after the bear vanished, only flashes of sky spinning above me and the taste of blood and metal thick in my mouth as my buddy dropped to his knees beside me. His gloved hands fumbled at my jacket, trying to press wads of gauze against the gashes on my arm and shoulder, and I could see panic battling discipline in his eyes. I tried to tell him I was fine, but the words came out as a wet choke, blood bubbling in my throat as pain radiated down my left side like a forest fire. My body shivered uncontrollably, not just from cold, but from the shock crashing through my system in relentless waves. Snowflakes landed on my face, melting instantly in the heat, pouring off my skin as my friend barked into his radio for medevac support. The forest around us seemed impossibly bright and silent, the snow glistening like it wanted to pretend nothing had just happened. I caught glimpses of dark red soaking into the white, splatters trailing away where the grizzly had disappeared into the trees. My vision kept narrowing and expanding, like a camera lens trying to focus, and the world tilted sideways as my buddy tried to lift me onto my knees. I wanted to help him, but my arms felt like slabs of meat hanging useless at my sides. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard the bear again, a fading growl echoing through the timber, and my pulse spiked so hard I nearly blacked out. I woke up hours later, inside a chopper roaring over the mountains, strapped to a stretcher with IV lines taped to my arms, and dried blood caked along my jaw. The medic leaning over me kept saying, "Stay with me, soldier," his voice firm but tight, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. Every jolt of turbulence sent fresh pain screaming through my shoulder, a molten wire twisting under my skin, and I bit down hard to stop myself from crying out. My mind kept replaying the attack in jagged fragments, the bear's breath fogging over my face, the weight crushing my ribs, the feeling of teeth burying into flesh. I tried shutting my eyes, but behind my lids, I saw the grizzly's black eyes staring into mine, close enough to count the flecks of gold around its pupils. I thought about how small I'd felt beneath it, how helpless and exposed, and a shameful wave of fear rolled through me because I knew that moment had changed me forever. The medic's hand kept resting on my chest, steadying my breath, and I focused on that touch as the only anchor keeping me from tumbling into panic. Every time I blinked, I half expected to open my eyes and find the bear standing over me again, jaws wide and roaring, The roar wasn't just a sound anymore. It lived inside my chest, echoing against my ribs whenever I breathed too deep. By the time the helicopter started its descent, I was shaking so violently they had to strap my arms tighter to keep the IV needles from ripping free. At the hospital, everything blurred into harsh lights and the stink of antiseptic, masked faces leaning over me, metal instruments glinting under surgical lamps as voices murmured about tissue damage and nerve loss. The painkillers turned my veins into rivers of fire and ice, making my thoughts swirl and fracture like shattered glass, and every touch felt either numb or like I was being branded with hot metal. I remember flashes of my arm laid open on a table, bloody gauze piling up beside it, while someone said, "We need to check for tendon involvement." Each word felt distant and unreal, as though they were talking about a piece of meat and not a limb I'd carried a rifle with since basic training. Later, in the recovery ward, I lay there staring at the white tiles above me, counting every crack as if they were lifelines keeping me tethered to reality. Nurses came and went, checking tubes, adjusting morphine drips, whispering soft reassurances I barely heard. I kept drifting in and out, haunted by the Grizzly's roar echoing somewhere deep inside my skull. Sometimes I woke up gasping for breath, convinced I smelled fur and blood, even in the sterile hospital air. Once I ripped out my IV line in a blind panic, convinced the bear was standing at the foot of my bed, ready to finish what it started. The staff had to hold me down, murmuring that I was safe. But no place felt safe anymore. The days crawled by in slow motion as surgeons stitched up my arm and therapists tried to coax movement from fingers that felt dead and alien. The doctors told me I was lucky, that the bear hadn't crushed my chest entirely, that the claw wounds hadn't severed my arteries, that I'd walked away from something most people never survive. But even as they spoke, their eyes held that look I'd seen before in medics after IED blasts, like they were trying to hide the truth of how bad it really was. Every time I tried to sleep, my brain jolted me awake with the phantom weight of the bear on my chest, its hot breath blasting into my face, the roar vibrating through my bones. Friends from my unit visited, their faces shifting between relief and a kind of quiet horror as they glanced at my bandages and purple bruises blooming down my chest. I felt disconnected from them, like I was floating behind glass, watching them talk about normal things while part of me stayed back in the snow, pinned under those massive paws. My reflection in the mirror scared me. Hollow eyes, pale skin, scars twisting across my shoulder like claw marks on a tree. I kept hearing myself ask the same question over and over. Why did it let me live? What made it turn away instead of finishing me? No answer came, and the silence was heavier than any battlefield I'd ever walked. It wasn't just my body that was torn apart. It was everything inside me. Nights were the worst. Shadows stretched across the hospital walls, flickering shapes that sometimes looked like fur sliding between the curtains. I'd jolt upright, drenched in sweat, fists clenched as if I were still trying to push the bear off my chest. I felt hunted, even in the hospital bed, convinced the Grizzly might somehow appear beside me again, ready to finish what it started. The doctors kept calling it PTSD, telling me about therapy, about how trauma rewires the brain, but none of their words erased the memory of fangs inches from my face. My family called every day, voices trembling with relief and fear, but I couldn't find words big enough to explain how small I'd felt beneath that beast. I started writing everything down, and pages, trying to empty my head, but the ink seemed too thin to capture the roar that still echoed inside me. Sometimes I'd swear I heard it outside my window, low and rumbling, as though the Grizzly was circling me even now, unseen but patient. And beneath all the fear, a strange, gnawing guilt kept growing inside me, because part of me couldn't stop wondering whether I'd trespassed into its world and whether my survival had come at the cost of provoking something wild that should have been left alone. When they finally discharged me, Denali was still buried under snow, the mountains silent and watchful, as though they were waiting to see if I'd dare come back. The army gave me leave, sent me home with my arm bound in braces and a list of therapists, but part of me stayed in that clearing where the grizzly's roar still echoed through the trees. My parents met me at the airport, hugging me like they thought I'd dissolve in their arms. And though I tried to smile, I felt hollow inside, like something essential had been left behind in the snow. Crowds and city noise felt wrong after so many weeks in the hospital, the roar of traffic reminding me too much of growls and charging weight. At night, even surrounded by family, I'd wake up convinced I heard branches cracking outside my window, and I'd lie there gasping, feeling fur against my chest, the bear's breath blasting my skin. Friends kept telling me how lucky I was, how brave I'd been, but the word lucky tasted bitter on my tongue because I didn't feel brave at all. I felt marked, hunted, different. I kept seeing the grizzly's eyes in mirrors, in shadows, in every darkened doorway I passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it might find me again, even hundreds of miles from Alaska. I'd catch myself flinching at the smallest sounds, a dog barking, a car door slamming, and my pulse would rocket until I felt like I was back in the snow, pinned under claws. I started avoiding crowds, retreating into my room, trying to drown out the roaring in my head with music I played too loud. My family worried, but I didn't know how to explain that I was afraid of a creature that might never come back, but also afraid that it might. Eventually, I decided the only way to fight the fear was to face it, so I booked a flight back to Alaska, against every voice telling me it was insane. People thought I was searching for revenge, but I wasn't. I just couldn't live my life pretending the grizzly hadn't changed me. I wanted to see those mountains again, to feel the sharp cold on my face, to look into those woods and know I could stand there without collapsing inside. When I landed in Anchorage, the air smelled clean and raw, and for the first time in months, my chest loosened just enough for me to breathe without feeling the roar shaking inside me. I rented a truck, loaded it with gear, and drove north, tracing the same roads that led toward Denali's silent white teeth cutting into the sky. Each mile closer made my pulse spike, but there was also relief in the fear, a certainty that hiding would only keep me frozen in the same place forever. I passed stretches of forest where sunlight dappled the snow in gold, so beautiful it hurt. But my eyes kept scanning the trees, half expecting to see that huge brown shape waiting between the trunks. I pulled over often, standing in the hush of the pines, listening for branches breaking, testing myself to see if I could handle the memories clawing at the edges of my mind. And every time the wind rustled the branches, I braced for a roar that never came. When I reached the edge of the park, I stood there gripping the metal railing, staring out at endless snowfields beneath a sky so bright it almost hurt to look at. The mountains seemed closer than before, like silent witnesses to everything I'd endured, and for a long time I couldn't move, my breath clouding the air in ragged bursts. Part of me expected the grizzly to appear right then, as if drawn to the exact spot where our paths had crossed months before. But the forest remained still. No tracks, no deep breathing in the shadows. I closed my eyes and forced myself to remember the weight of its paws on my chest, the smell of its fur, the way its eyes had bored into mine without hate, only hunger and curiosity. And slowly, something shifted inside me, a tiny realization that the bear hadn't attacked out of malice, that it had simply followed the law of the wilderness, driven by instinct older than any human memory. The thought didn't erase the scars on my arm or the panic in my chest, but it loosened the crushing guilt that had settled on my shoulders like snow piling up unseen. I whispered into the cold air, "I forgive you." And I didn't know if I meant the bear or myself, but either way, the words felt like lifting a stone from my chest. For the first time since the attack, I didn't feel quite as hunted. In the weeks that followed, I started speaking publicly about what had happened, first at veterans groups, then at wildlife foundations who wanted to understand how humans and predators collide. Telling my story felt raw, as if tearing scabs off wounds that still bled, but each time I spoke, the roaring in my head quieted a little more. People listened, wide-eyed, sometimes tearing up when I described the bear's weight, its breath, the pure terror of feeling like prey. And afterwards, strangers would press my hand and whisper that my story gave them courage for their own battles, even if theirs didn't involve claws and teeth. I learned that fear wasn't something to bury, but something to name and carry, like a scar that proves you survived. I began working with groups that educate hikers and hunters about grizzly behavior, hoping maybe I could help someone else avoid the nightmare I'd stumbled into. It didn't erase my trauma, but it turned it into something I could use instead of something that used me. And in quiet moments, I'd find myself wondering whether the bear was still out there, roaming the same ridges, just as much a survivor as me. We were connected now, bound by blood and silence and the wilderness that had tested us both. One crisp morning back home, I woke to frost glittering on the grass outside my window, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel my chest tighten at the sight of white landscapes. Instead, I felt a strange gratitude for the simple act of breathing, for the gift of waking up with a heartbeat. The bear's roar still echoed inside me sometimes, a memory lurking like a shadow at the edge of my thoughts, but it no longer controlled me. Instead, it reminded me how fragile life is, how thin the line between predator and prey can become in the span of a single heartbeat. I began running again, training my body to move without fear, though I still sometimes caught myself scanning tree lines for movement. When people ask me how I survived, I tell them it wasn't just training or luck. It was the will to see my family again, to live another sunrise, even if it meant facing something that wanted me dead. I've learned that courage isn't the absence of terror, but choosing to move forward despite it. And though I'll carry the scars for the rest of my life, I know now that I'm more than the day I met the grizzly, because that day, the wild didn't just leave a scar on my body, it carved a truth into my soul.